Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, June 23rd, 2022. The U.S. Supreme Court rules unconstitutional a New York gun law that requires people show a need before being allowed to carry a handgun outside the home. We'll get reaction from New York's Democratic governor, a Republican congresswoman, and President Biden, along with Vice President Kamala Harris, plus analysis from a Supreme Court reporter with Bloomberg News. Former President Donald Trump's attempt to use the Justice Department to further his plan to declare the 2020 election corrupted by fraud and thereby stay in power is the subject of today's fifth public hearing of the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. We'll hear from former Justice Department officials. White House COVID-19 response coordinator says more than 4 million vaccine doses for children under 5 years old have been delivered to about 13,000 vaccination sites across the country just since the FDA authorized the shots for this age group last Friday. Oil company executives meeting with the Energy Secretary about high gas prices at the invitation of President Biden, who has accused the industry of reaping excessive profits. And on this 50th anniversary of Title IX, the law prohibiting discrimination in education, including sports based on sex, Biden administration proposing to expand protections to transgender students. From Associated Press, in a major expansion of gun rights, the Supreme Court said Thursday that Americans have a right to carry firearms in public. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote for the majority, the Constitution protects an individual's right to carry a handgun for self-defense outside the home. In their decision, the justice struck down a New York law requiring people to demonstrate a particular need for carrying a gun in order to get a license to carry one in public. The justice said that requirement violates the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. That from AP. New York Governor Kathy Hochul reacting to the decision, a news conference in Albany.
Today, the Supreme Court struck down a New York law that limits who can carry concealed weapons. Does everyone understand what a concealed weapon means? That you have no forewarning, that someone can hide a weapon on them and go into our subways, go into our grocery stores like stores up in Buffalo, New York, where I'm from, go into a school in Parkland or Uvalde. This could place millions of New Yorkers in harm's way. And this is at a time when we're still mourning the loss of lives, as I just mentioned. This decision isn't just reckless, it's reprehensible. It's not what New Yorkers want. And we should have the right of determination of what we want to do in terms of our gun laws in our state. If the federal government will not have sweeping laws to protect us, then our states and our governors have a moral responsibility to do what we can and have laws that protect our citizens because of what is going on, the insanity of the gun culture that has now possessed everyone all the way up to even to the Supreme Court. The law we're talking about has been in place since the early 1900s. And now to have our ability to determine who is eligible for a concealed carry permit. This is not an ordinary permit. This is a special use that you can hide it from people. We have limitations if it's for a proper cause, someone who's been threatened, someone who needs it for their job as a security guard. We have classifications where it is allowed and have been allowed for over 100 years. But we do not need people entering our subways, our restaurants, our movie theaters with concealed weapons. We don't need more guns on our streets.
New York Governor Kathy Hochul, Democrat, at a news conference today. The case decided is New York State Rifle and Pistol Association Incorporated versus Bruin. You can find the oral argument from last November at our website, cspan.org. Audio only, that's what the Supreme Court has been allowing. It runs about 2 hours. More reaction to the decision. Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, Republican from Colorado, posting this video.
The Supreme Court just issued a landmark decision regarding your Second Amendment rights, and I'm happy to say they got this one right. On Justice Thomas's 74th birthday, he wrote the majority decision in which he has effectively ended May issue permit processes throughout the country. In simple terms, this means your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms shall not be denied by an unelected bureaucrat. But wait, there's more. The Supreme Court also found that Americans have the right to self-defense outside their home. You see, In New York, they were trying to limit gun owners to keeping their firearms in their homes. Of course, our founding fathers never intended that. We have the right to self-defense far beyond our home. While Senate rhinos are trying to capitulate and add more firearm restrictions on law-abiding citizens, the Second Amendment Caucus, the House Freedom Caucus, and the Supreme Court are working to ensure the Second Amendment, as our founders intended, is available to all Americans. God bless these justices, their families. God bless America, and happy birthday to Justice Thomas.
Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, Republican from Colorado, posting that video on Twitter. She mentioned the bipartisan gun safety bill making its way through the Senate. She did refer to rhinos, which stands for Republicans in name only. Today, senators voting 65 to 34 on a procedural vote limiting debate on that bipartisan gun safety bill, putting it on a path to final passage. 65 votes, it got more than the 60 votes needed. 15 Republican senators voting yes, along with the 48 Senate Democrats and the 2 independents who caucus with the Senate Democratic Caucus. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris also reacting to the Supreme Court decision on guns. First, here's the president.
Am I disappointed in the I will answer this one question. And I was just talking to the governor of New York about this. I am disappointed in the Supreme Court gun decision. There is one little bit of solace in the minority making up the majority opinion has laid out that it affects not every state. It affects only 40 states, a lot of states it affects. And the phrase that I found noticeable was, there's a difference between states that say may and say shall. If you have to say you shall give, you shall do A, B, C, they're the ones that are going to have problems. But most say may. I mean may, and I got it reversed, may and shall. And so the gun laws in 40 of these states are still in place based on the decision. Not good enough, but it's. I think it's a bad decision. I think it's not reasoned accurately, but I'm disappointed.
President Biden answering that question from a reporter at the White House at the end of a meeting on a different issue, wind energy. Vice President Kamala Harris meeting today with state attorneys general, originally to discuss the potential impact of another Supreme Court decision that's expected soon, the case involving a right to an abortion and the Roe v. Wade decision. But Vice President Harris taking the opportunity to comment on today's gun decision.
We, the president, myself, many of us are deeply concerned and troubled by the Supreme Court's ruling today. It, I believe, defies common sense and the Constitution of the United States. I was in Buffalo. I attended one of the funerals. We have seen the massacre of 19 babies and their teachers in Uvalde. We can go on down the list about why it yet again is on the front pages, so to speak, of the concern of the American people about what we can and what we have a responsibility to do in terms of reasonable gun safety laws. And it is for that reason that I believe that the Supreme Court's decision today defies logic in terms of what we know we are capable of doing with reasonable gun safety laws to secure the safety and the well-being of the people of our nation.
Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr has been looking at this Supreme Court decision issued today. He joins us now live. Thank you. What was the reasoning of the majority in this 6-3 decision?
Well, the reasoning is that the Second Amendment protects a right to keep and bear arms, and there was a focus on that word bear. The court said that right, it means you can have a handgun both at home and when you go out in public for self-defense purposes. And the court said that New York, by saying you had to show some special need to get a handgun permit, had infringed that right, made it so that the average person with ordinary self-defense needs couldn't carry a license, couldn't exercise their Second Amendment rights, and the court said that is unconstitutional.
There's been some reporting that this could have some impact way beyond New York.
It sure could. There are something like 6 states with laws like this that so-called may issue states that say we don't necessarily have to give you a permit a license when you apply to carry a handgun. You have to show us some special need, and so all those laws are in jeopardy. And then, of course, since the court hasn't issued too many Second Amendment rulings, and this one appears to be pretty sweeping, it could well have an effect on other types of gun restrictions.
A 6-3 decision. I assume this falls along the traditional conservative justices and liberal justices. What about the dissenters? How did they approach it?
Well, they approached it in part on a pragmatic level. Justice Breyer talked about the problem of gun violence in the country and the growing number of gun-related deaths. He talked about mass shootings, including the recent ones in Buffalo and in Uvalde, Texas. And he said the responsibility for figuring out what to do about that belongs with the legislatures, not with the courts, and the courts should not be involved in striking measures like this down and taking things away from state lawmakers.
New York's Attorney General Letitia James put out the tweet that said, "We're currently reviewing the decision from the Supreme Court on New York's ability to regulate who can carry firearms in public, but we will continue to do everything in our power to protect New Yorkers from gun violence and preserve our state's common sense gun laws." What can they do at this point, given this ruling?
Well, to some degree, that's not totally clear. But here are a couple things. First, in a concurring opinion, Justice Kavanaugh, who was a member of the majority, along with Chief Justice Roberts, made clear that states can not only require you to get a license, but they can also impose requirements. They can require training. They can require a mental health evaluation, things like that. And then secondly, the majority left room, as previous gun rights decisions have done, for the government to bar guns in so-called sensitive areas. And so we're talking about some government buildings and schools. And exactly what those sensitive areas are is not clear. Whether, for example, to use an example that came up during your argument, whether New York might be able to bar handguns in Times Square on New Year's Eve. That is not clear, but it's certainly something that state and local officials will be looking at to see if they can carve out some areas where you cannot bring your handgun.
We're talking with Bloomberg News Supreme Court reporter Greg Stohr. There have now been a couple of rulings in favor of gun owners' rights in the past couple of decades. How solid now is the precedent in the court for this position?
Very solid with this court, and this is the first major gun rights case where we've seen the three Trump appointees ruling, and they were all very solidly in the majority. I mentioned that Justice Kavanaugh did kind of make clear that there are some things that states can do, including those licensing requirements. But the overall mode of analysis, that what the court said is that looking at what Justice Thomas said is that when we're dealing with the Second Amendment, what we look to is the constitutional text, but also history and tradition. And we will look to see whether the country has a history of restrictions like this. And that's an approach that gun rights advocates have been advocating. The court embraced it here. It means that the court won't be involved in sort of trying to balance, is this effective and is this, helpful to public safety, this restriction? Instead, the court's just going to look to history. And, in this case, the court said history suggests that this is an atypical law and not something that we're going to allow.
Greg Stohr covers the Supreme Court from Bloomberg News. Find his stories at Bloomberg.com and on Twitter at Greg Stohr, Stohr. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. My pleasure.
This is Washington Today. Now to the January 6th committee. This from Associated Press. Donald Trump hounded the Justice Department to pursue his false election fraud claims, contacting the agency's leader virtually every day and striving in vain to enlist top law enforcement officials in a desperate bid to stay in power, according to testimony Thursday to the House panel investigating the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot. 3 Trump-era Justice Department officials testified that Trump was fixated on voter fraud claims and insisted they pursue them despite being repeatedly told that none of the allegations had any merit. That was AP. We covered this hearing. We're covering all the hearings by the January 6th committee. Here is Congresswoman Liz Cheney, the vice chair, Republican from Wyoming, previewing what evidence was going to be presented.
A key focus of our hearing today will be a draft letter that our witnesses here today refused to sign. This letter was written by Mr. Jeff Clark with another Department of Justice lawyer, Ken Klukowski, and the letter was to be sent to the leadership of the Georgia State Legislature. Other versions of the letter were intended for other states. Neither Mr. Clark nor Mr. Klukowski had any evidence of widespread election fraud, but they were quite aware of what Mr. Trump wanted the department to do. Jeff Clark met privately with President Trump and others in the White House and agreed to assist the president without telling the senior leadership of the department who oversaw him. As you will see, this letter claims that the U.S. Department of Justice's investigations have, quote, identified significant concerns that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states, including the state of Georgia. In fact, Donald Trump knew this was a lie. The Department of Justice had already informed the President of the United States repeatedly that its investigations had found no fraud sufficient to overturn the results of the 2020 election. The letter also said this, quote, in light of these developments, the department recommends that the Georgia General Assembly should convene in special session, end quote, and consider approving a new slate of electors. And it indicates that a separate, quote, fake slate of electors supporting Donald Trump has already been transmitted to Washington, D.C. For those of you who have been watching these hearings, the language of this draft Justice Department letter will sound very familiar. The text is similar to what we have seen from John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani, both of whom were coordinating with President Trump to overturn the 2020 election. When one of our witnesses today, Mr. Donahue, first saw this draft letter, he wrote this, quote, this would be a grave step for the department to take, and it could have tremendous constitutional, political, and social ramifications for the country, end quote. This committee agrees. Had this letter been released on official Department of Justice letterhead, it would have falsely informed all Americans, including those who might be inclined to come to Washington on January 6th, that President Trump's election fraud allegations were likely very real. Here is another observation about this letter. Look at the signature line. It was written by Jeff Clark and Mr. Klukowski, not just for Clark's signature, but also for our witnesses today, Jeff Rosen and Richard Donahue. When it became clear that neither Mr. Rosen nor Mr. Donahue would sign this letter, President Trump's plan necessarily changed. As you will hear today, Donald Trump offered Mr. Clark the job of acting Attorney General, replacing Mr. Rosen, with the understanding that Clark would send this letter to Georgia and other states and take other actions the president requested.
Congresswoman Liz Cheney, Republican from Wyoming, vice chair of the House Select Committee, investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, part of today's hearing. As she mentioned, the witnesses today included Richard Donahue, former acting deputy attorney general, Jeffrey Rosen, former acting attorney general, also Steve Engel, former assistant attorney general, Office of Legal Counsel. The main questioner presenting the evidence, Congressman Adam Kinzinger, the other Republican on the committee. He's from Illinois. Here's a portion of it as they talked about that time when President Trump was considering replacing the Attorney General.
All of President Trump's plans for the Justice Department were being rebuffed by Mr. Rosen, Mr. Donahue, Mr. Engel, and others. The president became desperate entering into the new year with January 6th fast approaching. President Trump rushed back early from Mar-a-Lago on December 31st and called an emergency meeting with the department's leadership. Here's Mr. Donahue describing the last-minute meeting held at the White House on New Year's Eve.
The president was a little more agitated than he had been on the meeting, in the meeting on the 15th. He discussed a variety of election matters. He did say This sounds like the kind of thing that would warrant appointment of a special counsel. There was a point at which the president said something about, why don't you guys seize machines?
Mr. Rosen, the president asked you to seize voting machines from state governments. What was your response to that request?
We had seen nothing improper with regard to the voting machines, and I told them that the real experts at that had been at DHS, and they had briefed us that they had looked at it and that there was nothing wrong with the voting machines. And so that was not something that was appropriate to do.
So there would be no factual basis to seize machines. Mr. Donahue,
I don't think there was legal authority either.
Yeah, Mr. Donahue, can you explain what the president did after he was told that the Justice Department would not seize voting machines?
The president was very agitated by the acting attorney general's response, and to the extent that machines and the technology was being discussed, the acting attorney general said that the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, has expertise in machines and certifying them and making sure that the states are operating them properly. And since DHS had been mentioned, the president yelled out to his secretary, "Get Ken Cuccinelli on the phone." And she did in very short order. Mr. Cuccinelli was on the phone. He was the number 2 at DHS at the time. I was on the speakerphone, and the president essentially said, "Ken, I'm sitting here with the acting attorney general. He just told me it's your job to seize machines, and you're not doing your job." And Mr. Cuccinelli responded.
Mr. Rosa, did you ever tell the president that the Department of Homeland Security could seize voting machines?
No, certainly not.
Mr. Donahue, during this meeting, did the president tell you that he would remove you and Mr. Rosen because you weren't declaring there was election fraud?
Toward the end of the meeting, the president, again, was getting very agitated, and he said, "People tell me I should just get rid of both of you. I should just remove you and make a change in the leadership, put Jeff Clark in, maybe something will finally get done." And I responded, as I think I had earlier in the December 27th call, "Mr. President, you should have the leadership that you want, but understand, the United States Justice Department functions on facts, evidence, and law, and those are not going to change. So you can have whatever leadership you want, but the department's position is not going to change."
The president's White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, was also present. Do you remember what his position was?
Pat was very supportive. Pat Cipollone, throughout these conversations, was extremely supportive of the Justice Department. He was consistent. I think he had an impossible job at that point, but he did it well, and he always sided with the Justice Department in these discussions.
A portion of the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, Richard Donahue, former acting Deputy Attorney General, Jeffrey Rosen, former acting Attorney General, testifying. Questions from committee member Congressman Adam Kinzinger, Republican from Illinois. Also during today's hearing, involvement of another Republican member of Congress in President Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election emerged. Congressman Kinzinger presenting evidence that Congressman Scott Perry, Republican of Pennsylvania, served as a liaison between Justice Department official Jeffrey Clark and the White House.
So on the screen, you'll see that President Trump's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, tweeted about that meeting right after it happened. He said, quote, "Several members of Congress just finished a meeting in the Oval Office with President Donald Trump, preparing to fight back against mounting evidence of voter fraud. Stay tuned." On the same day he met with these Republican members of Congress, President Trump called into a conservative political convention, and he used the opportunity to pressure the Department of Justice to investigate his bogus claims.
The problem is we need a party that's going to fight, and we have some great congressmen and women that are doing it, and we have some great fighters, but we won this in a landslide. They know it, and we need backing from, like, the Justice Department, and other people have to finally step up.
The Select Committee obtained records from the National Archives that show that Scott Perry was one of the congressmen who joined that meeting. We learned from White House records that you'll now see on the screen that the very next day, Representative Perry returned to the White House. This time he brought a Justice Department official named Jeffrey Clark. Representative Perry provided the following statement to his local TV affiliate. He said, quote, "Throughout the past 4 years, I've worked with Assistant Attorney General Clark on various legislative matters. When President Trump asked if I would make an introduction, I obliged." But why Jeff Clark? Let's hear Mr. Giuliani explain the kind of person that he and the president wanted at the top of justice.
I remember ever recommending to anybody that Mr. Clark, meaning Jeffrey Clark at DOJ, be given election-related responsibilities.
You mean beyond the president?
Correct.
Well, beyond the president, I do recall saying to people that somebody should be put in charge of the Justice Department who isn't frightened of what's going to be done to their reputation. Because Judge Trump was filled with people like that.
Should put somebody that's not frightened of what's going to be done to their reputation. Mr. Donahue, when you told the president that you wouldn't pursue baseless claims of fraud, was it because you were worried about your reputation?
No, not at all.
Richard Donahue, former acting deputy attorney general, questioned by Congressman Adam Kinzinger. And that involvement of Congressman Scott Perry, we also found out today, this is how Axios tweeted it out, former White House aides Cassidy Hutchinson and John McAtee testifying their depositions that 6 House Republicans sought pardons in the aftermath of the January 6th attack. Scott Perry, Matt Gaetz of Florida, Mo Brooks of Alabama, Louis Gohmert of Texas, Andy Biggs of Arizona, and Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. You can find today's full hearing archived at our website at cspan.org. We're covering all of the hearings. 2 more portions for you. One, Congressman Kinzinger is one of the 2 Republicans on the committee, the first time a Republican member has been the lead in presenting the evidence. At one point during today's hearing, he had a message for his fellow Republicans.
I want to take a moment now to speak directly to my fellow Republicans. Imagine the country's top prosecutor with the power to open investigations, subpoena, charge crimes, and seek imprisonment. Imagine that official pursuing the agenda of the other party instead of that of the American people as a whole. And if you're a Democrat, imagine it the other way around. Today, President Trump's total disregard for the Constitution and his oath will be fully exposed. Now let's get this hearing underway so we can do our part to protect the freedoms that we often take for granted, so that we can see how close we came to losing it all.
Congressman Adam Kinzinger. That was right before he interviewed the witnesses. At the very end, the committee chair, Congressman Benny Thompson, Democrat from Mississippi, previewed what's ahead for the hearings.
Up to this point, we've shown the inner workings of what was essentially a political coup, an attempt to use the powers of the government from the local level all the way up to overturn the results of the election, find me the votes, send fake electors, just say the election was corrupt. Along the way, we saw threats of violence. We saw what some people were willing to do in the service of the nation, the Constitution, no, in service of Donald Trump. When the Select Committee continues this series of hearings, we're going to show how Donald Trump tapped into the threat of violence, how he summoned the mob to Washington, and how, after corruption and political pressure failed to keep Donald Trump in office, violence became the last option. Our investigation is ongoing. Those hearings have spurred an influx of new information that the committee and our investigators are working to assess. We are committed to presenting the American people with the most complete information possible. That will be our aim when we reconvene in the coming weeks.
Congressman Benny Thompson, chair of the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, Democrat from Mississippi, closing out today's hearing. And we at C-SPAN are committed to bringing you all of these hearings live. Washington Today continues in a moment.
C-SPAN has unfiltered coverage of the House January 6 committee hearings investigating the attack on the Capitol. Go to cspan.org/January6, our web resource page, to watch the latest videos of the hearings, briefings, and all of our coverage on the attack and subsequent investigation since January 6, 2021. We'll also have reaction from members of Congress and the White House, as well as journalists and authors talking about the investigation. Go to cspan.org/January6 for a fast and easy way to watch when you can't see it live.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile video app and wherever you get your podcasts. A few more headlines. The Food and Drug Administration ordering Juul Labs Incorporated to stop selling its vape devices and cartridges. FDA says that studies in Juul's applications to market its tobacco products had insufficient and conflicting data about potential harmful effects. And from thehill.com, in a rare instance of bipartisanship, Republican Congressman Kevin McCarthy and Bruce Westerman and Democrat Scott Peters today introduced the Save Our Sequoias Act, aimed at expediting reforestation and protection efforts in California's Sequoia National Forest. Almost 20% of the state's sequoias have been lost because of fires since 2017. An update on COVID-19 vaccinations for children under 5 years old. Government authorizations for the Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines for this age group were just this past weekend. About 20 million children in the U.S. are under 5. Here is Dr. Ashish Jha, White House COVID-19 response coordinator, at a virtual briefing.
We know this vaccination program will ramp up over time. Remember, vaccines could not be shipped until they were authorized by the FDA on Friday. As of today, I can report that more than 4 million doses have been delivered within days of authorization to approximately 13,000 sites across the country. And as more doses are received and more sites make those doses available, that information will also become available on vaccines.gov. Now, when you look at this vaccination program for our littlest Americans, it will feel a little different than the vaccination programs we've run before. And that's because we know parents will be turning to their pediatricians and their family physicians. We have been guided in our approach by very clear data that says that most parents want to vaccinate their littlest ones in familiar settings. We also know that many parents have questions. And we want to encourage every parent to talk to their physician, to talk to the pediatrician, to talk to the family physician. We also know that confidence in vaccines builds over time. And I remind people that at the start of the adult vaccination program back in December of 2020, only 1 in 3 adults said they were eager to get the shot. Today, nearly 90% of adults have gotten at least one shot. We know the importance of working with trusted voices and community leaders, and we're doing just that.
Dr. Ashish Jha is White House COVID-19 response coordinator, leading off today's virtual briefing. A story at Reuters, nearly 1 in 5 American adults who reported having COVID-19 in the past are still having symptoms of long COVID, according to survey data collected in the first 2 weeks of June. U.S. health officials say long COVID symptoms range from fatigue, rapid heartbeat, shortness of breath, cognitive difficulties, chronic pains, sensory abnormalities, to muscle weakness. Oil company executives meeting today with Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. President Biden sending a letter of invitation last week, blaming the oil and gas industry for high prices at the pump and calling their profit margins not acceptable. A question to the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre about how the meeting went.
Secretary Granholm met with oil executives today. I guess has peace between the administration and the oil executives broke out, and more importantly, have some concrete ideas come out of this meeting. And finally, just why did the president, he stopped by the wind executive meeting we were just in, Why didn't you spend some time with the oil executives?
Well, let me
as
take your first question, and I have a bit of a readout for you here on the meeting. So at President Biden's direction, Energy Secretary Granholm, who was in front of you all yesterday, met with the CEOs and executives of the 7 major U.S. oil companies this morning at the Department of Energy headquarters in Washington, D.C. The meeting was a productive dialogue focused on creating an opportunity for industry to work with government to help deliver needed relief to American consumers. The Secretary highlighted the fact that the U.S. has achieved record oil production under the Biden administration, and that President Biden is taking historic actions to add to that supply. So the Secretary made clear that the administration believes it's imperative that companies increase supply of gas, and she reiterated that the President is prepared to act quickly and decisively using the tools available to him as appropriate on sensible recommendations as well. So this is an ongoing dialogue. I think you've heard, some of you may have heard from the oil companies themselves saying it was productive. And so what Secretary Granholm has called on is for her team to continue having conversations with the oil companies. As it relates to your second question, look, the President, it was a stop by. This is something that he does very often. There were governors in that meeting who were virtual and in person. So we see this as a part of his schedule where there was actually a meeting here at the White House.
White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre with reporters in the White House briefing room. High gas prices and what can be done about it, also the subject of a speech on the House floor by Republican Congressman Tom McClintock of California.
Joe Biden and the Democrats promised to wage war on fossil fuels, and they've succeeded. On his first day in office, he canceled the Keystone Pipeline, which today should have been completed and be delivering 830,000 barrels of crude oil every day into American markets. He canceled oil and gas exploration on federal lands. Just last month, he withdrew 1 million acres of land from exploration and production in oil-rich Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico. And he blames Vladimir Putin. Under the pro-growth policies of the Trump administration, America didn't need Putin's oil. We were energy independent for the first time in our lifetimes. We were producing more oil than Russia and even of Saudi Arabia. The day the Democrats took office, gasoline was averaging $2.39 a gallon. Today's sky-high fuel prices are aggravating supply chain breakdowns and adding to consumer prices. Acreage once devoted to growing corn for food is now used to produce ethanol, which requires trading an entire acre of corn to produce just 550 gallons of ethanol. And the irony is, at a time when these Green New Deal policies can't guarantee enough electricity to keep the lights on this summer at any price, these Democrat elitists are telling families to buy electric cars. Well, where do they think the electricity for their electric cars comes from?
Congressman Tom McClintock, Republican from California, on the House floor. Checking the average price of gasoline today on the AAA website, it's $4.94 a gallon, averaging across the country. That's actually down 6 cents from a week ago. On Wall Street today, the Dow up 194, NASDAQ up 179, S&P up 35. On the 50th anniversary of Title IX, writes the Washington Post, the Biden administration proposed sweeping changes to the landmark law that would bar schools, colleges, and universities from discriminating against transgender students, a move that comes as the battle over transgender rights moves to the front lines of the culture war. Well, Title IX became law 50 years ago, June 23, 1972. It prohibits schools that get federal funds from discriminating on the basis of sex. This proposed reform from the Biden administration led Senator Tommy Tuberville, Republican from Alabama, to go to the Senate floor today and ask to pass his bill to prohibit transgender girls from competing in girls' sports.
On this 50th anniversary, we should be asking ourselves, how can we preserve Title IX and preserve fairness for all female athletes across our country? But unfortunately, women's athletics are currently under attack by the Biden administration. Just this morning, we learned that the Department of Education will publish a proposed rule to change Title IX to align with the administration's progressive agenda. These proposed changes would allow biological males to compete in women's sports. What a tragedy. It would take a wrecking ball to the 5 decades of Title IX success for women. The Biden administration's proposed rule flies in the face of the so-called science that Democrats are quick to pledge their allegiance to by ignoring the scientific differences in the biological makeup of male and female athletes. Apparently, science only matters when it conforms to Democrats' partisan agenda. Allowing biological males to compete in women's sports will set women's rights back 50 years to a time before Title IX.
Republican Senator Tommy Tuberville on the Senate floor asking to pass his bill by unanimous consent, that is, no senator objecting. In this case, there was an objection. Senator Mazie Hirono, Democrat from Hawaii.
My Republican colleagues falsely claim that allowing transgender women and girls to play sports is harmful to cisgender women and girls. They continue to hurl insulting lies about transgender girls dominating sports. But what is true is that these bans are deeply harmful to transgender girls, particularly transgender girls of color, girls who are gender nonconforming or born with intersex traits, as well as cisgender girls. These sex tests invade every girl's privacy and opens the door to harass anyone who is perceived as different. If my Republican colleagues were actually worried about women and girls in athletics, they would join in our efforts to address unequal athletic opportunities in school, unequal pay, sexual abuse and harassment, and more. But this isn't about supporting women and girls. This is about discrimination.
Democratic Senator Mazie Hirono on the Senate floor objecting to the attempt from Senator Tuberville to pass his bill to prohibit transgender girls from participating in girls' sports. Title IX is officially the Patsy T. Mink Equal Opportunity in Education Act in honor of the late Democratic congresswoman from Hawaii who championed the legislation to fight discrimination in sports and education. And today, in the U.S. Capitol, in Statuary Hall, a ceremony to unveil her portrait. Patsy Mink served 2 stints in the U.S. House of Representatives, 1965 to 77. She was the first woman of color elected to Congress. Then she left and came back 1990 until her death in office in 2002. Among those paying tribute today, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi.
Her contribution on Title IX is historic, and not only historic, it's personal in the lives of women and girls in our country and their families. Again, she triumphed. With this portrait, the extraordinary courage Patsy Mink will be known to all who come to the Capitol. Women and girls, and that's what I love about it, will know about her and that her relentless fighting spirit. Patsy Mink made an enormous difference for women and girls in our nation. Thanks to Patsy Mink, so many women and girls will have a springboard for success. Indeed, Title IX. Well, let me just say, Edith Green in the House was part of it, and Birch Bayh, I want to mention Birch Bayh was very much a part of it in the Senate. And those of you who were involved in this or its history know of that very well. So again, she was a leader, a pioneer, a collaborator, a cooperator, and she always did it with this beautiful smile while she dissected your arguments on the other side. Right? You remember that? And we always wondered how she could do that with such a beautiful smile. It's our hope that this portrait will inspire us to carry on her fight, not only to defend Title IX, but to build on its success and to build a fair future for generations of women and girls to come. Because when women succeed, America succeeds. Patsy, believe that? We do too.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, at the portrait unveiling today in the U.S. Capitol. ABC News reports that the portrait will be displayed as part of a series of portraits that recognize members of Congress who've increased diversity and representation in the House. Others include former Representatives Shirley Chisholm, first African-American woman in Congress, and Florence Kahn, the first Jewish woman in Congress. President Joe Biden welcoming members of the Wounded Warrior Project to the White House for the annual Soldier Ride. The Washington Post says that more than 24 veteran and active duty troops rode 2 laps around the South Lawn as part of the multi-day cycling event. The tradition of the Soldier Ride at the White House began in 2008. The Wounded Warrior Project, founded in 2003, and assists veterans as well as families and caregivers of service members who suffered a physical or mental injury or illness while serving in the military on or after September 11th, 2001. Here's the president.
This year, we have 7 active duty riders and 21 veterans. Many of you come from a war abroad only to fight a battle of recovery at home. It's equally as difficult, in some cases more difficult. Learning to walk again, to pick up your child again, to manage the effects of traumatic brain injury, to cope with post-traumatic stress that occurs, and it's not unusual. I want all our veterans to know we're so inspired by you. We're in awe of the sacrifices you've made on behalf of all of us to defend our flag and to reach this moment. You know, you're the best America has to offer. That's not hyperbole. You're the best America has to offer. You embody the soul and the spirit of the nation. As I like to say, you're the very spine of America. You're the spine of this country. You're who makes us what we are. The riders here today and your families and caregivers, we can never thank you enough. And that sounds like a trite statement, but it's literal. We can never thank you enough. But remember, on this ride today, you're not alone. You have the support of a grateful nation behind you today and every day. We're here to help each other, and help you cross the finish line together. May God bless you all. May God protect our troops. And to all the caregivers, again, thank you, thank you, thank you. You know, docs, I used to say, read all the time, docs let you live. Caregivers and nurses make you want to live. And it makes a gigantic difference. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
President Biden at the White House, also there, First Lady, the Vice President, the Second Gentleman, the annual Wounded Warrior Project annual Soldier Ride. A 4-day cycling event that aims to help wounded service members build confidence and strength. A press release by the project says that it has, since 2003, delivered $1.9 billion in programs and services that directly serve more than 200,000 injured service members, veterans, and their families at no cost. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. For more of Washington's top stories sent to you every day, subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word. Sign up at c-span.org/connect. Have a good night.